speaking about, my people being removed from the Southeast in the Trail of Tears and moved to Oklahoma, which was known as Indian Territory. Yeah, we were placed in a land that was not like the one that we came from. So then your stories and your knowledge base, your relationships, your whole way of being in the world is completely uprooted. You have to um, figure out what you're going to do in that new place, establish the new relations, and what do you do when you can't grow the same crops, and what, that sort of thing. And so if your ceremonies are all based on a particular type of corn, and that corn won't grow in, that sort of climate, then what are you going to do?
Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, host of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room Arts and Culture Podcasts. If you haven't, please take a second to rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Please make sure you're following us on Spotify or Apple. And did you know we have a YouTube channel? Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really means a lot. You can actually see a lot of our video episodes on YouTube. And if you don't want to listen to any ads that are going to happen throughout the episode, even though I love all of our sponsors, of course, you can listen to our ad-free episodes on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And right now, you can get 1 week for free to see all of the ad-free episodes. And all of those episodes are also video episodes. So you can get to watch me, the guest, and you can also listen to all of Mary's True Crime and Academia episodes ad-free. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, and welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I'm really just excited doesn't capture, I think, the importance of this conversation. So I'm excited to learn more information about Indigenous philosophies, but also as a non-Indigenous person, um, I really want to learn just what it means to have this conversation and a back and forth and just be an open listener. So right away, I want to acknowledge that I don't know a lot about Indigenous philosophies. So this author here has really opened my eyes. I want to introduce you all to a very special guest, Dr. Andrea Sullivan-Clarke. She is from the Wynn clan of the Muscogee Nation of Oklahoma. A first-generation college student, Andrea graduated in 2015, so not too far in our history, from the University of Washington with a PhD specializing in the use of analogy and metaphor. She is the co-editor of the American Philosophical Association's newsletter on Native American and Indigenous philosophies, is writing an entry on American Indian philosophy for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay, well, that's such an accomplishment because that's where I turn to all of my ancient Greek research for philosophy and ancient Greek society for my dissertation. So I'm so glad that you'll be represented there. Um, she previously developed a summer enrichment program for high school students at DePaul University, and she's looking forward to collaborating with the local First Nations communities to develop similar programs at the University of Windsor. And I'm here to really dive deep into her recent work called Ways of Being in the World, an Introduction to Indigenous Philosophies of Turtle Island, just published September 2023 by Broadview Press, our very own sponsor. So, Andrea, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Andrew, it is really an honor to be here. And my first podcast.
Well,
So
welcome to
I'm
your
just
first
thrilled.
podcast. Um, I know you'll have a good experience. So, we're having just a coffee chat. Before I started recording, Andrea talked about listening to my parents' um, episode that I did with them when I was home for the Thanksgiving break, but also Native American Heritage Day is really what I wanted to highlight. Since Thanksgiving has such, we can get into it, but a vexed history of not acknowledging the indigenous people or telling a very colonizer side of the Pilgrims meeting the Native Americans. Well, first, I want to ask you, Andrea,
Mhm.
because in your book, I see you don't use the term Native American. is there something of importance of maybe is that term not appropriate? Is it because of its vexed history?
I think it has to do with because I'm located professionally right now in Canada, and so they don't use that term Native American, right? They use First Nations to refer to some indigenous people that are I guess, the equivalent of American Indian or Native American for us. But then in Canada, they also have the Métis, which are those people who have an ancestry with European, so during the fur trade, so they have a history of a combination of the First Nations and the European traditions in order, and so coming together and creating their own culture and their own language, their own way of being in the world. And so that was represented in the text as well. So I tried, because I was representing indigenous philosophies on Turtle Island, I really wanted to be respectful of all. So I was trying to cast this wide net, and I think the terms that you use are really important. So I steer clear of Native American, but I think that is probably the term that's most used in the United States, whether some people think that's appropriate or not. I mean, I think any of the types of terms that you use, whether it's indigenous, First Nations, or Native American, Métis, Inuit. All right. Well, Inuit, I think might be more specific. But if you're using the terms like Métis and First Nations and Native American or American Indian, you are overlooking the specificity or the particularity of the person's identity.
Mhm.
Because I'm Muscogee, I identify as Muscogee, and only Native American in this very loose and general sense of with others, maybe we have, some things. So there's this worry of ignoring the differences of these different nations, people that belong to these different communities. And so I try to use the tribal names if possible, or the community names if possible. So you'll see in the book, if there's an author, in parentheses next is the community from which they identify, or which they are part of. And so that to me was more important. I don't necessarily think the term Native American is offensive. I think I've had non-Indigenous people come up and ask me about, well, is it American Indian or is it Native American? Well, I want to say it's neither. And if you're devoting your energies to that, then you're
Mhm.
not looking at some of the other issues that are really much more important to Indigenous people, such as the return of Native remains, or the protection of Indigenous children from unfair social pulling them out of Indigenous
Mhm.
homes, right? So making it, or worrying about the environment, or worrying about sacred spaces. And so really, I don't think of the labeling with
Yes.
with those terms as one of the things that's like top priority for
Mhm.
Indigenous people. It's just one of those things that kind of bothers us
Yeah.
on a regular basis, right? It's just one of those things we have to deal with. So I think that's a really good question of, well, what would you like to be referred to? And I think most would like to be referred to as a member of the community in which they came to be.
So
Yeah.
you're like arguing that if someone is so devoted to trying to say, like, oh, hey, I have a person of color friend, or like, that they're so afraid that they're going to be called out for, being racist, or, they only want to deal with, okay, I can use the right term. And if I use the right term, that means that I know that community. That does
Yeah.
not go far enough. Like, you need to learn the cultures
No,
or do
yeah. Oh,
more
that's,
depth of
yeah.
learning. There's more
Yeah.
depth to that
That
question.
that's a really good point, because when you stand in relation, your way of being in the world means you stand in relation to all things, then it really demonstrates that the relationship that you have is not a very deep relationship
Mm.
if you aren't using the term of the people from which they come from. Yeah, it shows a superficiality, I think, of your relationship with them. So it almost betrays that you really don't have as close a relationship as you think you do, or as you're trying to portray. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I always say I'm a huge reality TV fan, and I always say like reality TV gives us like a platonic truth. Like not the ideal truth, but it gives us like such a heightened way of what's happening in everyday relationships. So like recently on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, there's been a lot of back and forth about um like one woman who is white calling a cast member who's the well, I think now she's the second black housewife of Beverly Hills, but like the white housewife said, you're attacking me, but doesn't use that language with the other white women. And there was like an important lesson of, well, why are you using this term directly towards me? Um, and not like calling that white woman a racist, but like just trying to educate her. But the white woman was not listening. Like instead, kind of said, I don't see color. I have a black friend. And like that's where I feel
Mhm.
um learning is
Yeah.
not like that it's important for like when I watched Killers of the Flower Moon or even having this conversation to decenter myself. Like you are the person who is coming with the knowledge of the indigenous community. Like it's not on me to dictate the terms.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to be very, very careful that to say, that I'm Muscogee and I come from the Wind Clan. And I'm really and in my book I say I'm coming as a philosopher, and that is the only experience. So I can't speak for all the other indigenous people out there. I
Mhm.
can't speak for all the other communities either. And I have to be very respectful. So I respectfully presented what I take to be some of the things that a Western philosopher would identify as doing philosophy.
Mm.
But I don't want to say that's it. I'm speaking for everyone, and this is it, right? I have to be really careful about that because there are, well, I think there's over 1,200 federally recognized communities in the US and Canada that are First Nation or Native American. And then there's more Métis, there's more Inuit, there's more Native Alaskans, right? To speak for everyone is a big danger. And I wouldn't want to do that. So I provided an introduction to the philosophies, right?
Mhm.
So acknowledging that there's going to be difference when we can't put them all together and lump them all as the same. And each community is going to present different things. There might be some similarities out there. There's some creation stories that might be shared. There's some practices that might be shared. Um, Things like a powwow might be
Mhm.
intertribal, might not be. And so really the idea of standing in relation to indigenous people and indigenous communities, you you should know who your local indigenous communities are, right? So that you can know what types of history they've experienced and what types of cultures and beliefs and things that they have. And it would be much more beneficial for your relationship with them to know these things, I guess is what I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
so I don't
And
think you could look at the book and say, "Oh, I know everything there is to
yeah,
know."
yeah. Yeah. Well,
Right?
and you make such an important like in your introduction even you outline that like you're kind of countering the whole notion of I don't see color. Like to not see differences is actually not
Mhm.
progressive. It's actually discounting and ignoring someone's like me being gay. If you say, well, I don't see sexuality. It's like, well, my life is different, but that doesn't mean we can't unite. If anything, it means we respect each other and build from that. Is like that where you're going with that? So, have you heard me talk and gush about my friend Christian Garcia's podcast, That Old Gay Classic Cinema? if you are like me and you remember when you went to Hollywood, MGM Studios, whatever it was called, when we went to the Great Movie Ride, I remember the Great Movie Ride so vividly when The Wicked Witch of the West appeared in Munchkinland. And it was such a nostalgic trip. And as a child, that's how I got to learn so much about classic cinema. And I started to grow a fascination and admiration for it. Well, Christian's podcast is not only for classic cinema lovers, but for all film lovers. He looks at different films and sees their queer elements. So, for example, he did an Alfred Hitchcock Vertigo episode that I had the pleasure of being on. He's done Rebecca by Alfred Hitchcock. He did a Wizard of Oz episode. He did a Dracula episode, The Sound of Music. There's so many episodes that he's covered. And it's so nice because you can listen on Apple, Spotify. He has a YouTube channel. So be sure to follow his podcast and please give him a 5-star rating because trust me, you're going to want to binge listen to all of the episodes.
Completely, right? They've often said that if you don't recognize color, then you don't see oppression when it occurs, especially systemic, right?
Mm.
Institutions can actually be oppressive. And if you don't see color, then you don't see how those institutions affect people of color. I use that term sort of lightly, people of color, because as an Indigenous person, you would think I would be a person of color, but I actually pass for white most of the time. So I have a really different sort of experience than other Muscogee who actually have the phenotypical traits, right? Or
Mm.
they fit the appearance, right? They're the expected appearance of most people. I oftentimes experience pushback. I'll say, "Hi, I'm from the Muscogee Nation," or something like that, and they'll say, "Oh, you don't look Indian, you don't look
Mm.
indigenous," right? And it almost feels like I have something to prove. And so I consciously, when I knew I knew I would be engaging with you so that we can see each other. I didn't put on, the big turquoise ear. I purposely did not try to, as sometimes I do when I go to talks and I feel like, oh, I have to establish my credibility, right? It is like, no, I'm not going to play into that sort of appearance. But seeing color, saying that you don't see color means that you may not see a lot of things that happen that, so it's almost an ignorance in a way of some of the things that happen in society. And so appreciating our differences is not a bad thing. In fact, that's one of the phrases I use, choka hedlidos kedlidas is or so kedlidas hedlidos. I use that in the book as learning is good. It's a phrase in the Muskogee language. So knowledge is not a bad thing. Knowing that someone has different experience from you is not a bad thing. It actually makes the relationship that you have with them better in a sense because you know what will help them flourish and do better, right, in the world. And so you have obligations then to help them grow, be better, right? And so you can't do that if you don't know. You can't do that if you're ignorant in that way. Yeah.
Well, and I know that the right wing is going to love when I say this, but I'm not here to try to appease a certain political party anyway.
Right.
But I would even say, like, even like saying that, let's move on from what happened with the colonizers' history is in itself, it's such a privileged statement to even make. Like, let's not talk about reparations of, say, like me being on Long Island right now and growing up in New Jersey. I know
Right.
so like I've learned more about Native American history. Like Long Island, where I am right now, there were the Setauket
Mm-hmm.
um Native American tribe, which is why it's called Setauket. There's the Shinnecock Nation in existence in the Hamptons.
Mm-hmm.
So like the history is all around. And then in New Jersey, New York, it was the Lenape
Yeah.
Native Americans. And I think that, right, it's just so important the work you're doing because, like, talk about an institution that's steeped in systemic problems and racism. Like, even using my podcast name, The Ivory Tower, like there was this whole book. Wish I could remember the name right now, but it's like, oh, Ebony and Ivory. That's what it is. And I'm not
Mm,
sure if you know this book, Andrea, but it was all about how enslaved people were being used as laborers for the Ivy Leagues.
yep.
So, like, even in Princeton's beautiful architecture or Harvard, you have enslaved people's hands involved in the bricklaying.
Yep.
And we can't just move on. Like, we can't not acknowledge that. So like moving on from that, just it's so problematic.
Yes. And there's also, I mean, saying that it only occurred in the past neglects the implications or the things that indigenous peoples or people who have slavery in their history, that you're not just denying the experience at that time, but you're denying what they're experienced now. As part from Everly and Ivory, it was okay for them to be working and building on these institutions, but they weren't allowed to participate in these institutions. That was one of the things for indigenous philosophy. Was the initial movements where we had to stake a claim and say, hey, there's actually philosophical thought. Indigenous people are capable of indigenous philosophical thinking, to the same way, because a lot of philosophers in England, were saying how primitive or savage, or so you had these descriptors of incapable of higher thought. And so the doors were pretty much closed to these sorts of intellectual spaces for indigenous people and people of color. And so yeah, it's a very difficult thing, but it also denies that colonialism is still prevalent today, that there are still these sorts of things. And you mentioned you have the land names, you might have the street names, you might have those sorts of things. I noticed that when I was out in Massachusetts,
Mhm.
when I was on the job market early on, that you have the indigenous names, but you no longer see the indigenous people. And a lot of people think that, oh, they no longer exist, or they've moved away somewhere.
Mm.
And it's like, well, why, where did they go? Why did they go? And what experience are they living now, being away from the lands that were their homelands? And so part of that whole process, speaking about, my people being removed from the Southeast in the Trail of Tears and moved to Oklahoma, which was known as Indian Territory. Yeah, we were placed in a land that was not like the one that we came from. So then your stories and your knowledge base, your relationships, your whole way of being in the world is completely uprooted. You have to um, figure out what you're going to do in that new place, establish the new relations, and what do you do when you can't grow the same crops, and what, that sort of thing. And so if your ceremonies are all based on a particular type of corn, and that corn won't grow in, that sort of climate, then what are you going to do? um, and just thinking today about some of the fallout from, where would we be if we had not been removed? Where would we be if we had not been forced to go to residential schools, or losing our culture? Or, where would Black Americans be if they, had been allowed to be in these institutions? It wasn't like they didn't have people who were articulate. You read something like Frederick Douglass in his speeches, and you read something like Sojourner Truth, and you have these wonderful, articulate, and eloquent people who are speaking on these very intellectual types of things, and they're just not getting uptake because of the color of their skin or the community that they, are a part of. I mean, Sojourner Truth and Chief Seattle here out in Washington, he had lots of speeches about the environment, but they changed those speeches in order to make them sound consistent with the racialized picture of the person that they wanted. So Joyner Truth has a very different type of accent and talks like a Southern, person. And Seattle has the stilted English that is often associated with the stereotype of Indigenous people in the United States. And so those types of things, it made it so that the people of those time periods could actually listen to them, because these people can't be saying these wonderfully smart and great observational types of speeches. They can't be making these sorts of things unless, well, let's make them part of the stereotype, and then it becomes sort of a challenge to whether they're really saying these sorts of things. And yeah, it's a hard one, I think. And I don't want to make it a political type of thing. I think there's room for everyone to learn
Mhm.
and move forward. And yeah, so I hate for it to be a one group or another sort of thing. But I think there's a lot of learning that we could be doing, or remembering some of the history that has slowly just sort of filtered out of the curriculums in schools.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, and it's so interesting that, like, I'm so glad you brought us to the curriculum issue, just because I feel like there's a disconnect. I keep seeing this in society between academia and the entertainment industry, because in my opinion, the arts and culture that's happening in TV and film is becoming more intersectional, which is wonderful, but like retelling stories, like retelling historical narratives. The Gilded Age, their new season just had a really interesting discussion about um Black intellectualism, and even how, like breaking that stereotype that the North was so superior to the South when it came to racial stereotyping and prejudice. And they're like, no, no, no. Like, these Black schools in Brooklyn were faced with so many like budget cuts, or trying to like get rid of that education so that then the students couldn't go into trade school or into universities, right? And there's a quota for universities. And then we have Killers of the Flower Moon, which I thought, like in my opinion, just taught me so much about like how the culture of the indigenous people, like even their creation narratives, it's not something cartoonish. Like, it's not Pocahontas, which I don't know what your feeling is with the Disney film, but I feel like that shows you a really the romantic strain that is not
Mhm.
consistent with understanding who Pocahontas is. It's more about a colonized view of who she is.
Mhm.
So I thought Killers of the Flower Moon, in my opinion, teaching us about assimilation and like how much wealth this community had. And they weren't reliant, like they had to still rely on the colonizer, even though that was their land and they were making money from their land. So
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask you, like, do you feel that, I mean, if you first want to just address Killers of the Flower Moon, I'd be so interested in what your thoughts were on the film.
Yeah. So I might have a little bit of a different there's a documentary that I'd like to recommend. It's called Real Engine, ReelInjun, and it's produced and created by Indigenous people. And it talks about the Hollywood conception of Indigenous people and how it came to be, how it started out, what types of things, the stereotypical, and how there were many non-Indigenous actors portraying Indigenous, so it talks about the red face, things like that. The Recently, uh, we have the benefit of more indigenous movies, more indigenous characters. Um, so we have superheroes now
Mm.
that for Marvel that are indigenous. You have reservation dogs, which is actually my tribe. So I hope I'm not doing an unfair plug or something like that. But you have these creations. So you had like smoke signals. Skins. You have these movies that are created by Indigenous people with Indigenous actors, Indigenous writers, and things, and really they feel very powerful to me.
Mm,
The one thing about the Killers of the Flower Moon is that its its topic is Indigenous, but I worry about Indigenous writing. I worry about, so they did have Indigenous actors. So I think there's like improvements being made, but it was based on a book that was written by a non-Indigenous person. And so it has a perspective that's not completely like Indigenous. There's a female author who has a book called Mean Spirit who addressed the same situation earlier. And so the uptake for that book was less than the other one, right? And you have to like wonder why is that the case? So I think there are pluses and minuses to it. I don't want to come down, I think, oh, I do see ways of moving forward. I think including more people of color in roles that have been historically, like even like Jane Austen movies, having, in the Gilded Age, Bridgerton, these types of things where you have people of color in these roles, I think makes it a better story, makes it
yes.
more interesting.
Are you currently looking for your next great read and you just don't know where to search? Well, I have a publisher for you. They are called Broadview Press. They're celebrating their 40-year anniversary. Happy anniversary, Broadview. And they are an independent publisher of humanities books. So next month for Native American Heritage Month, I have on Dr. Andrea Sullivan-Clarke, and she is going to educate us on indigenous philosophies of Turtle Island. You might wonder what Turtle Island is. And if you're listening and are in North America, I'm just going to give you a hint. You probably are in Turtle Island territory. So I can't wait for you all to hear more about Native American history and culture, just subjects that we need to learn about and we just don't in our primary school education. So Ways of Being in the World is Andrea's book. I can't wait for more of you to get your hands on it. Also, just in time for the Wicked film, Broadview Press has an edition of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz with the original illustrations. I was talking with Dylan from Broadview Press, and I always love talking with her because she informs me of what new books they're about to release. And guess what? Just in time for spooky season in the fall, they have a vampire literature anthology that collects so many different short stories that explore the vampire myth and just how this origin story of the vampire came to be in our culture. So I hope you get your hands on those books. And Dylan told me there is an exclusive code for all ITBR listeners. You get 20% off all of your Broadview Press orders. Broadviewpress.com. Go choose your books, type in Ivory Tower in the discount code section, and you will get 20% off. Make sure you follow Broadview Press to see all the new books that they are about to publish on Instagram at Broadview Press. Enjoy your reading, everyone.
But I almost see an analogy with schools. So there was a question about indigenizing schools and curriculum and what would that actually mean. And it doesn't just mean importing some indigenous scholars in and letting them go, right? It's going to require guidance, respectful relations with locals. It's going to uh, be this sort of whole complete, it's like a holism to it, to developing an indigenous sort of um, institution of learning. I think the movies and television and things they need to have more of that type of representation and participation. So not just, I don't know, putting a feather on it, but actually involving indigenous writers, people of color who are authors, right? These sorts of things, and bringing in the perspectives more fully. So I see us as moving that way, but not fully immersed in the types of things. I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
even at Stony Brook, where I just got my PhD, there was been calls like every year that I was there. I was there for 9 years, Andrea. So I
Yeah.
heard the calls a lot. And again, I'm not right, and neither are you in your book placing personal blame on. It's not a personal blame, but it's an institutional question and just acknowledging that there needs to be more indigenous studies, but also like I come from queer studies, and
Mhm.
I represent like a gay white male view, which is overrepresented in some capacities, but also at universities queer studies isn't overrepresented as an institution. um so I just think it's so interesting because every year I would hear, oh, we really need a um Black literature scholar. And like usually, or they would say we need a Native American literature scholar. And I'm like, do you need the scholar? Do you need that work? Or
Yeah.
do you need a person who is of that group? Because those are two different questions. I mean, I think they're interrelated, but like you're saying, there's a difference between tokenizing a scholar, like,
Mhm.
oh, we've hired someone who is from that community. Like you could even say that about being gay. Then are
Right.
we going to actually support that scholarship? And is there going to be a community for that scholar who feels comfortable and has the
Mhm.
administration has their back, like when there are questions of they're doing DEI work, like, oh my goodness, the community is up in arms on Long Island because they're, teaching our young students um woke ideas, right? And like we see these calls in America, and I know
Yeah.
it's happening in Canada, unfortunately, of
Mhm.
like trying to censor material left and right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it becomes very scary. You made this really great point about just hiring someone based on their social identity really is a scary sort of idea. I mean, because when I was at the University of Washington, I studied primarily philosophy of science, and the reason that I did that was because there aren't really any places that you go to get a PhD in indigenous philosophy, right?
Mm.
You may be able to study with a scholar, but there's so few of us. I think there's under 15 that are actually working in the US and Canada. And so to be able to study, and if they're at a university that offers a PhD, right, in philosophy, then so it's really hard. So you could have hired me as a philosopher of science and not had any indigenous philosophy whatsoever. That was a possibility. Because my philosophy of science was on race science and the measuring of skulls, and my tribe happened to be donors, whether willing or unwilling, of their skulls, to create the chapter for this person, the scientist to measure skulls. Um, I had an interest in that sort of, social justice, I guess, sort of thought about science, which led me to thinking about the stories that I was given as a child and philosophy, and how reading some of the British philosophers and how they thought the indigenous people were too civilized, too uncivilized, too savage, too primitive to be capable of doing philosophy. There just was this, no, wait, we're able to do this sorts of things. It doesn't look like Western philosophy in that same way. So without me having that sort of inspiration to want to teach indigenous philosophy, right? Um, you could have easily had just a philosopher of science.
Mm.
Uh, and what you said about it's part of there's so many responsibilities, not just on the part of the scholar, but also on the part of the institution, like you said, where you need to provide them a space for them to develop their research. And what's that going to look like? Well, it's very difficult to do that as an isolated individual. Um, so having a curriculum specialist, a librarian who specializes in indigenous materials
Mm.
is just wonderful. And so I had those two individuals at the University of Windsor, and it was just great to be able to rely on them, and then having a community of indigenous people who were for the most part accepting, because if you think about it, I'm an American Indian working in Canada. It can be a bit problematic in the sense I had a lot of history to learn, and I was always worried that I would take the space of a Canadian Indigenous scholar, right? I don't want to do that. So that was another worry. Canada also has the issue of people who are claiming Indigenous identity but aren't necessarily Indigenous in order to secure positions at universities.
Oh,
And so universities are reviewing backgrounds of people who have, been Indigenous scholars for a long time so that's sort of a strange thing to realize, that you might have your ancestry looked at to see if you count, right? So that's another kind of remnant of colonialism that's peeks its ugly head up
it's
in a
almost
day.
like a Rachel Dolezal issue,
Yes,
like when she was
very
with
much.
the NAACP. Oh,
Yes,
yeah, that's. Well,
yeah.
do you feel like people are feeling, again, I don't think it's right to like claim an identity you're not a part of, but like I was even told, oh, Andrew, don't apply for that um like women's gender study or like even queer scholarship because they're probably really looking for a woman. And I'm like, well, is
Oh,
that allowed? Like, I mean, not that is that allowed, but I do feel like there's some. This is where I feel the university and Hollywood are actually a very similar institution where, like, who can believe that Lily Gladstone was the first ever Indigenous person to be nominated for a Golden Globe and then won a Golden Globe? Like, it's 2024. This
yeah.
is wild, right? And you could look at um Black actresses in categories, and there are not many who won over
Yeah.
time in the Oscars, especially. But like representation does matter, right? But representation matters. And like you're saying, Andrea, there's a next step. It's not just the representation.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's
not
not
just
feeling like
that.
that you have to, and it's not feeling that you have to say you're someone who you're not. Like that's also highly problematic.
Right, right. And you worry when people are giving the advice to people who are going on the job market, right? These are students who, I mean, for me, I would probably say, go ahead. You're definitely not going to get a position if you don't apply,
Yes.
but apply, and then it's the decision of the institution, right? It puts it back on the institution. They'll know what they want. Well, they may not. They may not know until they meet you,
Mhm.
um, and realize it. So some of it is fit. If you definitely don't have the scholarship, if you don't have the chops, you're probably not going to get hired. That's
Yeah.
sort of a given. So I've never worried about um, uh, Indigenous people or people of color. Uh, I've never said, oh, well, they just got it because they're Indigenous. No, that's not necessarily the case. The market for full professors is a challenge, and if you're not publishing, if you're not getting grants, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're whether your social identity is something that they want, they're not likely to hire you. Yeah, but I think that there's a lot more to it, like you pointed out. It's not just a social identity. It's not just research. There's a lot to indigenizing, and a lot of it has to do with the respect and relationship that you have with the Indigenous people. So I think it's a really good thing for institutions to think about relationships with communities, particularly local communities, the ones that are on the land in which the university or institution is present, is occupying.
Do you ever think to yourself, wait, how does Andrew know about so many of the newest and current LGBTQ books? Well, my friends at the Gay and Lesbian Review have an amazing magazine. The Gay and Lesbian Review is a bi-monthly magazine and it's always centered around a theme. So, for example, their November and December issue is called the Gossip Issue. And it features some authors who actually have been on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, like Ignacio Darnad, who runs the Breaking the Gay Code in R Instagram account. And I love that he's looking at Lorca and Dali in his newest article for the Gay and Lesbian Review. There's articles about D.H. Lawrence, about sodomy in the 1770s. Frank Rizzo, who is a theater critic, has an article, and I actually just recorded an episode with him. I can't wait for you all to hear it. We talk and gush about queer theater from the 1970s until the current day. The Gay and Lesbian Review has given me a promo code that I want you all to use. Go to glreview.org, glreview.org, type in promo code ITBR50 when you subscribe, and you will get 50% off your digital or print edition. I get the print edition because I just love to have a physical copy of the magazine. And the gossip issue, it's so exciting. My favorite Victorian author, Oscar Wilde, is featured on the cover holding a sunflower. So if you want the newest LGBTQ literature, film, TV, theater recommendations, you need the Gay and Lesbian Review. I hope you enjoy your reading, and please let me know if you are reading the Gay and Lesbian Review, what article you really liked, because I'll shout you out, and I'll even let the editors know, because I know they always want to know what the Ivory Tower Boiler Room audience is reading when they do get a Gay and Lesbian Review subscription. Okay, enjoy your reading.
I think it's really important to have a relationship with them. And so, yeah, that should sort of like be sort of a guide, what type of because that's going to inform hiring practices, what type of curriculum, whether you're offering a language as part of the Indigenous studies. Well, what language are you going to offer? Well, it makes sense to have, the local language, right? The language of the people that were there. And so, yeah, and so it's a lot more than just, are we offering, some students courses, and are we having students come, that are Indigenous come, because a lot of times you're thinking about the number of students and the number, like how much tuition you're making off of them, right? It's a business in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think of the business model of the university, you don't want it to just be that, oh, we're opening our doors and we're making it available for, yeah, that's it's not enough, really. If you think about historically how education has played a colonizing role in the lives of Indigenous people, that there's, I don't want to say reparations to be made, but there's some healing to be done. There's some listening to Indigenous communities, and Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers don't have PhDs, but they have much more knowledge than I do in particular areas. So it's respectful to listen to them and grant them that cognitive authority that we so oftentimes give to a few little letters at the end of someone's name. Right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Well, I'd love to also like bring this into the conversation, but I do want to give Stony Brook credit where credit is due. But
yeah.
they did launch a Native American and Indigenous Studies initiative, and I'm happy that the inaugural director is someone who um, taught me a lot about the Latin American novel and queer studies. So, Dr. Joseph Pierce said that as a Cherokee Nation citizen, I am proud to be working toward opening new pathways for Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, and hope that we can build strong relationships with community members and Indigenous tribes in the New York area. So it's exactly like what you're saying. It can't just be, it's breaking the walls of the ivory tower. Like to do
Mhm.
something like Indigenous studies, you need to then rely on the local communities around you. So,
Yeah.
that gives me hope.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you notice he uses relationship,
Hmm.
and it's because it figures so prominently in many of the philosophical thoughts of Indigenous communities. Yeah, in Turtle Island, respect, relation, what they call reciprocity, the giving to each other. Um, being grateful and humble are all part of that sort of the relationship and the receiving of knowledge and someone that wishes you well and you wish them well. It's yeah, it's really cool that he mentions relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I would, as we're nearing like the end, I have to definitely ask about that term Turtle Island because it also, in my mind, when I was reading your book, it ties into these tips that you're giving for either practitioners of like faculty teaching
Yeah.
indigenous studies or using your work as like a supplemental book for a philosophy course, intro to philosophy, and even just the public who's interested, which I think a lot listening want to learn more and are going to get your book because of
Yeah.
um diving into indigenous philosophies as like a first step is a book. Your book is a great first step of learning and the
Good.
knowledge. But you do have this one tip that I think is so powerful. And it came from that phrase, learning is good. But what is the phrase again? The
Oh, the
term?
choka hedlidas, kedlidas hedlidos. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not a native speaker of Muscogee, so I know bits and pieces. So
Yeah, yeah.
so that's one of those, features of colonialism, right? That has taken place. And so part of for me is a reclaiming and going back, a journey to going back to my roots and my history. Um, but
And yeah, there's this tip um that you give about like not thinking that Native American or indigenous literature, I can speak though of somehow how Native American literature was taught to us in schooling in America, which is they're all fables, they're mythological, and they're
yeah.
creation tales, but it really is seen like an Aesop fable. So like I thought it was so important that you outline these are not fables to the community.
Yeah, the stories are the knowledge is contained in the stories. The way of being is contained in the stories, and they're not necessarily giving you one way of acting in the story. So the storyteller provides the story in a particular context, and the listener takes in the story and uses it to think themselves, right? So a lot of times as philosophers we're thinking about creating arguments, and being very rational. This is a way of giving the listener to the story. It has a lot of freedom with respect, so they're a member of the tribe but they have a lot of freedom. They're told these stories but not necessarily the specific way to act, and so they take these stories and develop how they should act, um, and how they should be. If they want to be like for me, if I want to be a good Muskogee, then I take these stories and I figure out what's the best way for me to be in the world. What's the best action for me to do in this particular situation? Um, Realizing that I'm trying to promote harmony and prevent discord is part of like the themes in Muskogee story. So part of being a good Muskogee, living a good Muskogee life, is to promote harmony. And so yeah, and so when you mentioned Turtle Island, I had some pushback from people who were reviewing the proofs of the book. Were like, my tribe doesn't call it Turtle Island, and I was like, yeah, a lot of tribes, and communities do not refer to North America as Turtle Island. But for me, I wanted to give a head nod to another way of understanding North America, not just the colonial name that was given to it, right? Not just the European name, but a name from an indigenous community that called it Turtle Island, and it came from their creation story. Um, I wanted to do that, and I said that I wanted to hold that name there until we had one that applied, like for that all indigenous communities said, yeah, we'll call it this. I wanted to like use it as like a place saver, as to hold that, to hold that name, to hold that thinking about what if we thought about this as a place that indigenous communities existed before European contact. And that was one of the names that they had. So that was why I referred to it as that, because, yeah, so there were some people that were not happy with that term until hopefully, until I explained that. I hope that they're happier now than they were, because, yeah, because it was important to me not to use a colonial name in the title of the book. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of colonial terms, I mean, I've been so inspired by Lily Gladstone, just like learning more about, you know, her like tribe and community. And she had this just really profound way of talking about sexuality and gender, which was like she goes by she and they, but she said in um her language, there is no gendered pronouns. Like there is this catch-all of how to identify people. Like they would be the appropriate terminology, but like she's so open about that there's so much Native American knowledge around sexuality that just disappeared because of the colonizer system. And I feel like your book does so much to look at these intersections between gender, sexuality, that it's not easy. It's not
Yeah.
an easy answer of how did the indigenous communities describe sexuality when you're trying to use the colonizer's language, right? What
Yeah.
was that? Like Audre Lorde, right? Said about like
Yes.
using the master's tools to
Tools.
dismantle the
Yeah.
house.
Yeah, if you think about like the residential school systems, those were oftentimes headed by the churches, and so they imposed definite gender roles. In Canada, the Indian Act uh, made the man the head of the household, right, for Indigenous families, and imposed gender roles on Indigenous people. So yeah, a lot of communities did not have these sorts of male female type pronouns. They may have had specific roles for gender, but they weren't weighted one more heavily than the other. They were both respected and both needed. There were many times in several of the, like the Haudenosaunee, where the women are the political authorities. They're the ones that are the leaders of the community, and
Mm.
so they witnessed, with the imposition of governments, Western style governments, the imposition of those types of things. They lost status, they lost their power, right, within their community. Those sorts of things are, yeah, I wanted to have more articles of Two Spirit, these sorts of readings that would have a welcoming space, an inclusive space for people, because I wanted to put together a book that I would have liked to have had when I was a student. I wanted
Mm.
something that would give me representation, would give me mentorship. It would give me it's okay, you're here. You
Mm.
belong here, right? I
Yeah.
wanted that. The problem for me was COVID. So authors, agreed to provide readings for me. And so I thought I had, bases covered and things like that. But then, COVID became this reality for so many people that they were struggling. And so it was really, really hard. I realized when I put the book together that, it's going to be missing a lot of things that I wanted to put into it. But I moved forward thinking that it's okay, because it's only like a little slice in time. There's going to be hopefully more people coming after that are going to provide these sorts of things. So, and there were readings that were out there. So, Leanne Simpson
Mm.
provides a wonderful chapter in her book, As We've Always Done. And Lee Maracle has written on one of the chapters in her book is called "Isn't Love a Given?" Whoever you love, isn't that just because it's love, isn't that all right? And it's just such a, powerful sort of reading for me that, so there are things that are out there that I thought if I can create. So I'm working on creating a website to go along with the book. And then the book also has a QR code in each chapter so that you can go for more materials and more readings. But I'd like to create a website where I can just keep continually putting things in as they're developed, because I know that it's not all good. It doesn't all have to come from me. It can come from all the wonderful scholars and individuals who are out there working in these areas, and I want to be able to showcase them. So that's kind of like what's moving forward with the book. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much for a beautiful, moving, just open and transparent conversation, Andrea. And I can't wait for more people to get their hands on ways of being in the world. And this is only the beginning. Hopefully, I'm sure there will be a second edition where more can be added to your work, more scholars, more writers, more from the community. Um, so everyone out there, please use our code Ivory Tower for 20% off not only Andrea's book, but all Broadview Press books, which is great. So I have the link in my show notes for the podcast. Andrea, thank you so much. And how can everyone out there, if they're inspired to reach out to you, like what's the best way to contact you, social
Right.
media, all of that?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm also at the University of Windsor, so you should be able to find me on the philosophy department page. Yeah, I'd love to hear from everyone. Yeah, that'd be great.
Great, good, good. Yeah, I have Andrea's page with the University of Windsor. So definitely, reach out to Andrea. I know that she would really appreciate it. And this is only the beginning of a conversation. I hope definitely to have you on again, Andrea. Especially if there's something in um, pop culture that addresses more Indigenous stories or Native American stories. I'd love to have your perspective because
Oh,
I think it's
wonderful.
important to have the back and forth dialectical conversation.
Yes.